You assume that prayer is speech, a movement of words toward God. You measure sincerity by expression, as if the depth of feeling could be weighed in sound. Yet Rumi overturned this assumption. He said that the truest prayer is not spoken, but understood in silence. When the tongue rests, awareness begins to hear something that speech has always covered. Silence, he said, is not absence, but the beginning of divine conversation. In silence, you do not address God. You become the hearing through which God addresses existence. What you call stillness is not the end of communication, but its essence. Rumi asked a question that still unsettles thought. If silence is the language of truth, what then is speech, revelation, or interruption? Rumi lived in 13th century Persia, a world shaped by scholarship and faith. Trained as a jurist, he spoke with authority on law, theology, and reason. Yet his meeting with Shams of Tabriz dissolved the very structures he had mastered. He discovered that truth does not pass through speech. It reveals itself when speech ends. After that encounter, words became for him the trace of silence, not its opposite. His poems are not the voice of a man reaching toward God, but of silence recognizing itself as divine. For Rumi, what speaks in silence is not the human soul. It is reality remembering itself. You live surrounded by speech, words filling your thoughts, shaping your actions, confirming your sense of being someone. Even when you are alone, language continues beneath awareness, translating every moment into meaning. Yet Rumi saw this as the first veil between self and truth. To speak is to divide what is one into two, speaker and spoken, listener and heard. The mind, seeking to describe reality, ends up creating its own distance from it. Words do not bring you closer to truth. They define the very boundary that hides it. If the real is beyond contrast, can communication that depends on division ever reach what is indivisible? For Rumi, silence was not the absence of sound, but the disappearance of the speaker. It begins the moment awareness stops identifying with its own voice. Silence is not created. It is uncovered. Beneath the motion of words, it remains unchanged, the condition of being itself. Rumi said that in true prayer, you do not send words toward heaven. You rest in the awareness from which both the prayer and the world arise. The real does not require your voice to hear you. It is hearing itself. When awareness and the divine are not two, what remains to say, and who is left to say it? Language divides what it tries to unite. Every concept defines by exclusion. It names one thing by denying another. Yet the infinite has no opposite. Rumi understood that the moment you describe God, you confine the limitless to a form of thought. To speak of truth is to turn being into an object of knowledge, and in doing so, lose it. This is why he said silence is not moral restraint, but metaphysical clarity. The infinite cannot be contained by speech, because all speech belongs to contrast. You speak only within the limits of what is known. But what if the real cannot be known? Only lived, not said, only heard. Rumi taught that knowledge begins where thought ends. Thinking divides, labels, and arranges, but knowing in its truest sense does not require comparison. In silence, you do not analyze truth. You stand within it. This knowing is immediate, not derived from argument or proof. It is not something the mind achieves, but what remains when the mind stops claiming ownership of understanding. You cannot construct silence. You can only stop mistaking thought for knowledge. Rumi said that this is not ignorance, but awakening, the recovery of what was never lost. When thinking ends, awareness remains. But if awareness itself is knowing, what is there left to learn? Rumi describes silence as the meeting point where hearing and speaking become one act. The one who listens and the one who is heard are not two presences, but two faces of a single awareness. When you listen deeply, it is not you who listens. It is the real hearing through you. Prayer, then, becomes circular. The voice you call your own is answered by the same awareness that gave rise to it. In this realization, Rumi found the unity of devotion. The soul does not speak to God, nor does God speak to the soul. Both are movements of the same knowing. If there is only one awareness, who is praying and who is being prayed to? Even when external words stop, thought continues its quiet movement, translating silence into inner dialogue. You observe yourself thinking about not thinking, commenting on quiet, measuring stillness. Rumi warned that this is the subtlest form of speech, the mind's final attempt to remain separate. True silence begins when even the idea of silence ceases. You do not make the mind still by command. You see that thought is already appearing within something larger. When you no longer take thought to be your identity, silence reveals itself as the background of all experience. The question then shifts. Does silence begin when thought ends, or was it present through every thought you mistook for yourself? In Rumi's view, silence is not withdrawal from devotion, but its highest expression. Ordinary worship divides the worshipper and the worshipped, a self addressing the divine as other. But in silence, that division collapses. Awareness stands alone, unseparated from what it contemplates. This, he said, is the purest remembrance, for it remembers nothing in particular. The self does not praise God. God praises himself through the self. When worship loses its subject, devotion becomes existence itself. To be silent, then, is not to withhold speech, but to allow reality to reveal itself without interference. If the one who worships disappears, does worship continue, or was it always God's act from the beginning? You began by seeking silence as an achievement, a discipline to master, or a reward for restraint. Yet Rumi's teaching ends in reversal. Silence is not something you enter. It is what you uncover when the illusion of separation dissolves. Every word, every prayer, every thought has always emerged from it and returns to it. Silence was never absent, only unnoticed. When you stop identifying with the voice that claims ownership of experience, you find that everything speaks, yet nothing needs to be said. This is not emptiness, but understanding without division, the realization that awareness is already whole. And when all questions fall silent, what remains is not the lack of speech, but the presence of truth. Silence, in Rumi's method, is not the rejection of sound, but the unveiling of being. It does not wait for quiet surroundings or mental control. It appears the moment you stop mistaking thought for identity. Words express difference. Silence recognizes unity. Through this recognition, prayer changes its meaning, from an effort to reach God to an awareness that God was never elsewhere. The one who speaks, the one who listens, and the one who hears are a single reality observing itself. You began this reflection wondering whether silence could speak to God. Now you see that silence is God speaking through everything, including you. And in that realization, what more could speech ever add? The journey begins with the belief that prayer requires words and ends with the recognition that silence is the ground of all communication. The movement is from sound to awareness, from the effort of reaching to the stillness of being. Each stage strips away a form of division: speech from silence, mind from knowing, self from the divine. Rumi's insight reveals that silence is not emptiness, but the fullness of unity, the direct awareness through which God and creation know each other. The listener discovers that silence is not the absence of life, but its most complete participation. When words fall away, nothing is lost. What remains is the silent intelligence from which everything arises, the silence that speaks,